Then we have on the 15th evening at 5:30, Indo-German Business Dialogue. We are bringing it to you live from Germany. We're going to talk about all what's happening in Indo-German business, where our president of MMA and a couple of members of MMA also talking in this platform. Not to miss this. And we also have the Minister of State for Finance. He'll all be talking to us. Then on the 17th, we have another interesting event, Grandeur of Action, Medical City to Excellence by Mr. Vinayji going to be talking to us. Most importantly, which I want to tell you is the event which is happening on next Saturday. Next Saturday, we have a talk by the Pons veteran, Change, Innovation and Disruption in My Company, where Mr. Neeraj Chandra, Senior Advisor, will be talking to us. We have again an outstanding panelist lined up. Thanks to Mr. Balraman. We have really top-class outstanding leaders going to be talking to you. And the special invitees include Mr. Arvind Balaji, is a Joint Managing Director of Lucas TVS. Irina Vittal, she's Independent Director. Rajiv Agarwal, Founder CEO of Innovative Payment. This is happening on next Saturday. So we have also lined up many more activities. And coming to today's event, as I mentioned to you earlier, China, business, technology, economy in 2020. And this is the only time where you are going to get the insider's view of China's growth. This is actually an event initiative by MMA and Pons Veteran to continued support of our Atmanirbhar initiative, because that is the understanding what we want to do, because we have to be self-sufficient, we have to be innovative, and towards that extent, this input will be a great insight for you. We have some outstanding panelists. The distinguished speaker for this evening, Mr. Venky Nagan, Group CEO of Asmara International Limited, Hong Kong. Then we have Mr. Mahesh Sriram, Principal Consultant and Managing Director, India Leadership Innovation Services. Then Ms. Pallavi Aiyar. Ms. Pallavi, thank you. She's joining us from Spain, award-winning journalist and foreign correspondent and author. And Mr. Pandit. Mr. Pandit is a founder and chief executive of Pinnacle Leadership Consulting and former managing director of SHL India. Then to chair this session, we have our own veteran and our own Bhishma Pitama, as we call him, Mr. Balraman. Mr. Balraman, all you know, need no introduction, but let me have the privilege of introducing Mr. Balraman. In fact, the entire event series which has been put forth, design idea is by Balraman. We are only a catalyst, we are only executing. And he keep thinking constantly how to improve the quality of this thing and how we take it away to the next level in terms of not only content, quality, the form, everything. And that really makes it very interesting. Mr. Balraman is from IIM Ahmedabad and former director of Hindustan Unilever and MD of Pons, and he's also worked in a number of other corporate as independent director. He enjoys coaching, mentoring, leadership, helping build brands, and mission leadership is leadership development. He has been a past president of MMA for 2 sessions, and he continued to be engaged with a number of initiatives. You can be rest assured, next few months we are going to have some outstanding initiative, including some innovative program for veterans who are retired and who are also looking forward to something. Over to you, Mr. Balraman, to introduce the session, and very warm welcome to all the viewers watching the program, all the viewers watching this program live on our webcast, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our Facebook. And also, as usual, please, if you have any question, share it to the numbers which is coming on your screen. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Balraman.
Thank you, Group Captain. Ladies and gentlemen, today's program is kind of special. Kind of special because it is very topical. Everyone in the world wants to know a lot more about this curious picture that is emerging as China. We in India, more than anyone else, because we are very keen to make sure that we catch the business that is moving out of China and is showing very strong inclination to come to India. Now, we in MMA have already started with something to help Atmanirbhar. We have started a 24-week course of teaching MSMEs TQM, Kaizen, and high productivity, low cost, and high quality. But if we have to do all this, I think we in India have to understand our major competitor, which is China. China is at once a major competitor and also in a sense a predecessor in this field. They seem to have, from an outside view, they seem to have built a very huge business very fast. And they seem to have built a very high technology business as well. They seem to be a formidable competitor. But we in India are very innovative. We never give up. Like actor Rajinikanth said, even if we come late, we'll come latest. Now, in order to do this, we do need people who have gone behind the bamboo curtain, who have seen life to be what it is, what is true, what is not true, what is imagined, and what is propaganda, but what is real. It's very, very important to have this clear appreciation. I'm very thankful to this very illustrious panel. They are all very close friends of mine, but still, I think it is very, very generous of them to give up their time and prepare to speak to you here. The one Ponds veteran is anchoring this program, that is Venky Nagan. So, Venky, will you lead? And we will come to Pallavi from Madrid. Pallavi is speaking to us from Madrid. And Mahesh is a veteran who has done Silk Road many times. And Pandit has been there in Hong Kong and set up an office and ran it very successfully several years ago. So, Venky, will you please lead?
Thank you, sir. Hi, everybody. These are some of my observations from my nearly 20 years of work in the Far East with Chinese. I lived in Hong Kong and China for a little more than 10 years. I've been very interested in their culture. I made a lot of good friends, business associates, partners, and associates in our company, and tried to learn a lot from them, tried to read up. If there are any errors and omissions, please excuse me. I'm very open to learn more from this session. I first start with this map of China with a particular reason. How the transformation happened, and it was with the state's own interest and a lot of support from some of the developed countries nearby. So the northeast provinces like Heilongjiang, Liaoning, they got support from Japan. Japan adopted them. Places like Shandong got support from Korea. Fujian was adopted by Taiwan. Guangdong was adopted by Hong Kong. So this strong influence came from these neighboring countries who brought in suitable technologies, factories, and opportunities. Some numbers about China. A very large country, almost 3 times the size of India. The population is almost similar. One common language, except for 2 or 3 of the far-flung provinces, which helped a lot in bringing them and keeping them together. The youth unemployment, the unemployment itself is very low, 1.7%, but youth unemployment is remarkably low, where India has something like 20% and more. The few good things they did was that from 1978, Deng Xiaoping brought in a focus to try to open the country and develop the country. And in 1978, when he took over, the people below the poverty line were 88%. And today they are at 1.7%. The life expectancy from 1978 to now has improved by about 10 years. Their infant mortality has come down from 53 to the 1,000 to 8 per 1,000. And literacy has also improved. The state provides free education up to class 9. And the labor force participation by women is 60%, where India is at about 25%. The economic liberalism is a transformation story of 40 years. I sometimes think to myself, what if Deng Xiaoping had not happened there and that transformation did not start in 78? What would have been China? I shudder to think maybe it could have been one large North Korea again. But things happened in the right way. In 1980, their GDP was less than India. And then today they are at about 14 trillion, and India is at about 3.2 trillion. Just a fun fact, the state GDP of Guangdong province is 1.5 trillion. And if we just add up the state GDP of Guangdong and Shandong and Jiangsu, that overtakes India. China, of course, is a global trading power. They're trading at about $4,600 billion, where 54% is exports. India, relatively, is at about 844 billion. China's trade with India is about $100 billion. So for them, relatively, we are not a very big trading partner. For us, they are important because we import $75 billion of product from them. China has tweaked the RMB to the dollar very opportunistically and very intelligently, and tried to maintain a parity where the imports and exports are both supported. So to conclude, I would say that China is a very interesting mix of Confucian tradition, communist orthodoxy, and super capitalism. Along with Deng Xiaoping, there was also another economic mind, Zhu Rongji, who contributed a lot to where they have reached today. How they think. Now, the government policies are there to create self-sufficiency, stability, and continuity. That is the bigger approach. They have something called the whole nation system, which started as a system to support sports and develop a number of world-class athletes. But actually, there's also another parallel whole nation system regarding education and students. Some of their best minds are groomed in special universities and also some military universities, and provided, and their talent is developed for serving the country. China as a country has global ambitions. You take their Belt and Road Initiative, which is a big Silk Road kind of movement to connect countries from China to Asia, to China to Africa, China to Europe, and also China to Australia. So this is one of the big moves made by the present government. China, for example, has made a lot of inroads into Africa. If you wonder why, Africa has a lot of minerals. So the Chinese are interested in the minerals. The Chinese are not there in Africa to make textile garments. They are there for minerals and also into infrastructure. China has made a lot of developments and inroads into Myanmar. To an extent, Myanmar is kind of another province of China. In Myanmar, there are 600 garment factories, 400 are owned by China. The road from Shanghai to the border of Myanmar is so well developed that fabric is able to reach from the textile mills in eastern China to the border of Myanmar in 10 days. 2 days for import clearance, another 1 day to reach the factories, and the factories are into production. The other reason China has taken a lot of interest in Myanmar is because it's one of the countries where the Mekong River flows, and it's an important river, and water, of course, is a resource of the future. So China has a lot of interest in Pakistan and Myanmar for those reasons. Pakistan also gives them access to the Gwadar port. China has developed infrastructure extremely well, which means power, roads, railways, ports, communication. They, in general, think big, and they think number one. I know of some of my mid-sized garment dyeing factories, fabric dyeing factories, and he tells me, I want to be the best dyeing mill in Jiangsu. So even within their system, they try to aspire and be the number one. They are, in general, implementers of technology, not particularly inventors, and they're not ashamed about that. The people, They want to be safe. They want to be respected. They are a collective. They are not standing up for individual. They work as a team. They look up to the government, and the government unites them, and they want to be led. Even a team, they cannot perform without a leader, and they want to be led. And so they are good at working as teams. Guangxi and Renqing are two important concepts there. Guangxi in particular, it means relationship. They are very particular about personal relationships and trade relationships, business relationships. That means with their customer, with their supplier, it is not uncommon for a factory of a vendor of mine to come over to meet me at my office, but also bring along another factory owner. And then while discussing, if I say, oh, you don't make this, then he'll say, oh, my friend makes this. Here it is. So they help each other and they support each other. It's not uncommon that on the road there's a small car accident. Both the drivers will get down, they will exchange cigarettes and start making relationship there. Because you never know where they will be helpful for each other, because the small accident can be anyway sorted out by some small intervention by the police. In general, the people have hope. There's a lot of hope. The poverty has been removed, so that has brought a lot of hope, and they are therefore looking forward. They say that Apple and Amazon are not the happiest places to work, but the people don't care because they are successful companies. China is somewhat a story like that. The happiness is not the important thing. It's about being successful and an important country. How do they plan their projects? These projects is what help them to set up the base, the infrastructure. They first of all identify the right potential industries. At some point of time, the industries could have been iron and steel, mining, cement, automobiles, aluminium, fertilizers, machine tools, armaments, and food. But as times progress, they are willing to recalibrate the list of potential industries going into artificial intelligence, drones, e-commerce, electric vehicles, robotics, space. So firstly, they identified the right thing to do. The government supports them with land and tax subsidies. They invest first and then develop and course correct later. Take an example. There is a Taihu Lake in Jiangsu. They found that suddenly in 2005, it has become completely green with algae. This is because of years and years of effluents from the textile dyeing mills coming out onto the lake, and the water was no longer drinkable. So then they started a panic action. It was not uncommon for pollution board people to go to the factories with the chain and padlock and lock it up, and they shut down all the small units and then revised their standards for water pollution. In general, their approach is to finish projects on time, if possible, early. Ideally, they try to finish a month early, a week early, at least a day early. Let's go into power. Their installed capacity is 2,000 gigawatts, and 25% of that is coming from new energy. So they have the vision to identify these new energy opportunities like solar and wind and nuclear. They set up they commissioned the Three Gorges hydroelectric power plant, which is one of the wonders of modern engineering world. 22.5 gigawatts and 14 years. It took them 14 years working 24/7, but they did it, and they also helped to resettle some of the villages. It has also helped them to control their flooding problem. But all in all, an important power plant, which is a wonder of the modern world. China adds additional power every year, the same amount which Spain uses in a year. So they add additional power to that extent. So they try to fix all the basic problems so that the production and the factories are all well supported. Let's go to semiconductors. They have a vision and a goal to meet 70% of the needs of their own needs locally by 2025. In April 2018, when America decided to ban ZTE, Xi Jinping arranged a meeting with his industry leaders within a month in May 2018. I'll come back to the story a little later. Coming on to railways, because it's a large country, it has to be connected. They have 139,000 kilometers of railway lines, almost double of India. Two interesting engineering projects here, the Qinghai to Lhasa train in Tibet. 1,400 kilometers, but 1,000 meters in that is set up at altitudes more than 4,000 meters. So they had a lot of interesting engineering challenges, and they've overcome all of that to set up this train line 1 year early. 1 year early. They have set up a train system through Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan to Europe, and it's actually functional. A lot of my produce is actually going by train from China to Germany and Spain now. Recently, China had the foresight to jump when they had the opportunity to set up the Tesla Gigafactory. 1.5 years, that's all it took for them to go from land approval to commission to start production. This is one of the projects which is entirely an American investment. They were able to change their mind. They did not wrangle about their being half China, America. They said, it's okay. We accept 100% American investment. Regarding their operational strategies, they develop ecosystems in clusters. We also have clusters in India. We have Tirupur as a cluster. We have Ludhiana as a cluster. We have Surat as a cluster, just for example, in the textile industry. But the Chinese, they have clusters, but also the complete infrastructure, the complete ecosystem of all the vendors and all the sub-assemblies available around. So this is a difference. The government provides a lot of incentives, which are typically called tax rebates. In India, they're called duty drawback, etc. I have an example. 2005, January 2005, the global textile quotas were going to be abolished, and the world was going to become a level playing field, and China was expected to boom. At the same time, it was the date was set for all countries. Around February of 2005, the Indian government withdrew duty drawbacks. So these kind of signals can often be very confusing to the industry when they know China is going to run like a big boy, and and then the people went on representation to the government and said, this is an emergency, please, can you arrange a meeting? An emergency meeting was convened probably after 4 months. So the speed and agility, the support is very important part of the Chinese system. They have labor incentives, it's all piece rates, and the workers and the staff, they have a lot of respect. Among the business units within the enterprises, there are profit centers and profit sharing. In general, the unions are passive. Therefore, they believe that we don't have any gossip. we have only work. The government has done a good job on skill development using a lot of vocational training schools. The people are getting more tech savvy. In the global innovation index, they are at about 14. India is about 48. Vietnam is 42. I have a supplier called Cashon in Ningbo. My company, after a lot of thought, we decided to go in for 3D designing, three-dimensional designing, and we invested 2 licenses for India, 2 for China office, 2 for Vietnam office, 2 for this office. This one company, Cashon, has 50 licenses. That is the way they go. They go with muscle, they go with scale, and they go with power. Of course, the government and the banks support them. They are agile and their thinking is very innovative. My sample room in Hangzhou makes samples in about 6 working days and couriers it out to Zara. And the fabric is nearby, the fabric is rushed, and then the sample room makes the sample. But what is my competitor? What did he do? He moved his sample room to Spain. A Chinese sample room sitting in La Coruña, just outside Zara. Now this, I could not beat him on that. So these are some interesting things our competitors do and we learn from them. Size matters. And this inspiration came for them certainly from USA. Because once Deng Xiaoping decided to embrace the world, USA decided to embrace China, and trade was going to be a big opportunity. For example, the entire city of Chongqing is kind of modeled on Chicago. So everything is big, McDonald's, Kentucky. So they like the big scale concept. The banks, they favor the bigger and stronger companies. Let's take the example of Media and Galans, 2 Chinese home appliance companies. One is making washing machines and the other is making vacuum cleaners. So Media is making washing machines, Galans is making vacuum cleaners. They reach the peak of in that category. Then Media decides to make washing machines, vacuum cleaners. Galans decides to make washing machines. So they just go with the proposal, get their approvals, and they go into production. I want to talk about the Canton Fair. It is an amazing fair held in Guangdong, and it's held in 2 times a year in 3 phases because of the number of products they have to cover. And it is a place where business is really transacted and huge orders are closed. I went in and walked around Canton Fair for the first time. I went to a booth and I picked up a garment. I looked at it and I made some remarks. Next day, I was back in my Hong Kong office and I saw that same product which I had picked up has been sent to me. I did not ask for it. This is initiative. So they are really switched on and they know how to promote and develop business. And for those who cannot go to a Canton Fair, there are places like the Shanghai Mart, which is a 365 days a year exhibition. So it's one huge mall where all the suppliers from all over China have their stall and booth all the time. There is this Yiwu consumer product wholesale market, an amazing place. It is a Disneyland for the consumer products business. There are huge malls all around the city. One mall is only for stuffed toys. One mall is only for woodware. One mall is only for household plastics. So you can go there and buy 1 piece, 6 pieces, or 600,000 pieces. So it's really one of the amazing places and how they think in terms of their business development. In terms of capacity and delivery, yes, there were days when the factories were really large. So large that for me and my customers to traverse from the line number 1 to line number 20 of the t-shirt factory, we needed golf carts. And why this scale matters and this size matters is, let's say a customer like Uniqlo, he has got an order for 100,000 pieces. He knows that things may go wrong in the pre-production, the planning, and when it comes down to crunch, who will catch the delivery faster? The factory with 1,000 pieces capacity in India or 10,000 pieces per day capacity in China. So they always get the benefit of the doubt because of their scale and capacity. They've already gone ahead to develop baseline on the electric vehicle batteries, and the two of their companies are in the top 5, CATL and BYD. A number of other Korean and Japanese companies are also producing in China. I come to a couple of areas where I believe they struggle. They have a culture of cost cutting in the factories, and there is a rampant problem of counterfeiting. There's also a problem which some people call as a quality fade. You start in January with an order with a quality level here, and if it is a never out of stock item and you look at the product 6 months or 7 months later, the quality has come to here. So one has to patrol a lot and try to really play games to achieve the quality standard. This is, I believe personally, is because of their mindset of frugal nature and trying to, they believe that one should not spend too much, and if something can be cut down to a cheaper level, they do it. But not always do they take approvals and permission. The counterfeit business, again, I believe it's their mindset that they feel, why should only some people have Louis Vuitton bags? Why shouldn't others lower down in the strata also have Louis Vuitton bags? And they go around copying Louis Vuitton bags because that doesn't need any marketing. They just need to copy it. Some of the names shown here are typical fakes and copies. YSL was a particularly interesting one, because not only was there a bag called YSL, there was a bag called SYL, there was a bag called VSL, and there was a bag called LYS. There is this Land Wind car, which is a direct copy of a Range Rover Evoque. And it was launched almost at the same time when the Range Rover was being launched. So these interesting anomalies exist, and one keeps wondering, how did they do that? Now we come to subcontract. Subcontract is a way of life. They don't think anything wrong about it. They just take it for granted. They don't always ask for permission, but subcontract is something you have to live with if you're producing or sourcing from China. Let's say there's a factory. You place your order for certain product there. That factory is a profit center, and he makes his own make-buy decision, whether I should make it in-house or the factory subcontracts, because they think it is cheaper to buy outside. This is not only for apparel, it's there in engineering, it's there in many other industries. The shadow factories of China, now these are factories, there's a front factory, which is the face to the client, and then behind are other factories which don't always follow all the compliance and laws of the land. Transshipment, in the past there were quotas or restrictions trying to control the amount of export from China, but China would find a way around it, make in China, move it to Singapore, Cambodia, Dubai, repack, redocument, export. So transshipment has been a problem with them. And then the famous China's third shift. They get an order for Hugo Boss shirts. They make 2 shifts for Hugo Boss, and the third shift, extra product, completely with all the right labels, and it's a precise copy. It's the same product, but sold in other outlets. So I think where they falter are in areas of product integrity, I had in my apartment complex engineers from Bosch, Germans who had come to work. They are walking around their factory, looking at the ball bearings, and they are so experienced, they can feel that something is wrong. And they ask the supervisor, "It's today, this batch, the feel is not right. What's the reason?" And that guy scratches his head and says, "Sir, this was made in another factory." He says, "Where is the factory?" "Sir, it's in Nanjing." He says, "Take me there. I want to go there." Gets into a car, goes all the way to Nanjing. He finds the factory there making his ball bearings. The infant milk powder case was very famous. The infant milk powder had melamine, plastic components, which were added to increase the protein content of the powder. So this is not something which just happens by default. That is why I say it is something from the culture. In subcontracting, I had placed an order for shirts, and my factory tells me, when I go to inspect, there's nothing going on in the factory. I said, "Where are my shirts?" He said, "It's in Anhui." I said, "Let's go to Anhui." We go to Anhui, and in a village, I found almost every house was making my shirts. That is the level of subcontracting which goes on. JU Gongchang is another word for prison factories. My QC, quality controller, goes to a factory and says, "Can I inspect?" They said, "No, it's been subcontracted." So he says, "Okay, let's go." With a lot of cajoling, they take him there, and he's suddenly standing outside the prison. Now, the state prisons have a lot of workshops, not only for tailoring, but also for engineering and some other industries. So my QC could go inside. He inspected the product. He brought back some production samples. They were pretty good, but something was troubling me. Is prison factory production humanely acceptable or not? And I raised the question to Ethical Trading Initiative in the UK, and they said, "No, sorry, we cannot approve you. You better pull back." So this leads, China, of course, is often blamed for dumping because of their mass production. One has to be very careful on IP issues with them. And more recently, they've been bellicose in terms of their trade wars, not only with the US, but also with India and some other countries. So I come to my last question. Can India be as big as China? Now, you see, they started in 1978, the reforms. We started in 1991. We already were 13 years behind. Today, we are at 3.2 trillion. They're at 14 trillion. When were they 3 trillion? Also 15 years back. So I think it's not unfair to say that we are 15 years behind them. As time progresses, maybe we will be more. So it's not about trying to be as big as China, but trying to do something nicely and have our own position in the global forums. So these are my few suggestions. I feel that we must give economy the primacy, which I believe is not being given. I think we should cast a vision for 2047. That is when our country will be 100 years old. And we should be forward looking. Our policy should not be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The government should try to lay the carpets out, offer incentives, remove the constraints, lower operating costs, and try to make the factories thrive. We should pitch for FTAs like Vietnam. Vietnam has been so cunning about this. They were working on free trade agreements with USA at the same time with Europe. Their Europe FTA has come through. Their CPTPP with Canada and Australia has come through. In USA can happen later. So free trade agreements are very important to boost the business. We have to benchmark and improve our ease of doing business. All the parameters on ease of doing business are very relevant and directly reflect on and will contribute to pickup of Indian industry. I think that we should partner with Taiwan and Singapore on electronics because our dependence on China is about 66% on our imports of electronic product. And we should take on Koreans and Japanese as mentors. Wherever the Koreans and Japanese have gone, they've developed the industry very well. Japanese bring in the quality angle. Koreans bring in the discipline into business. I think where we can differentiate ourselves, and we have to make world-class quality and execution our brand. We have to try to set a time plan for self-reliance. We can't say that we will stop importing from China tomorrow. It's not going to happen. It cannot happen, should not happen. Our FDIs will also come down. So I think we should set a time plan, a reasonable time plan for that. We have to sharpen the saw in terms of our skills, our competence, our logistics, infrastructure. We should try to develop Northeast India. I think a lot of potential in that area, and that will also help us keep those states closely bonded with us. We have to maintain our software as a services leadership and our startup leadership. We have to be assertive. We have to try to be a little more powerful. Chinese people respect that. So that brings me to the end. I now pass on the mic to Pallavi. Pallavi, Wang Ying Ni, Shinzai Wo Yao Fayan, Juni Xie Shunli.
谢谢你的韩语很好。Thank you very much, Venky. That was a really interesting introduction, and it resonated with me. Having lived there and worked in Beijing between 2002 and 2009, I reported on many of the sort of issues and also some of the places that you mentioned. Obviously, I had written a lot about the challenges of Indian businesses, and also tried to unpack the complex of reasons behind China's success in dragging itself and transforming itself from a bit of an agricultural backwater into the kind of manufacturing and infrastructure superpower that it has become. But I was also, for example, on the very first train from Beijing to Lhasa that you talked about, which was, as you correctly mentioned, an engineering marvel. And there were only 30 of us aboard that train. And I actually wrote about that journey and the subsequent week I spent in Tibet in my China memoir, Smoke and Mirrors. I also wrote extensively about the Yiwu market. And I often said that the Yiwu market was more spectacular and amazing and jaw-dropping than the Forbidden City. And there were like really amazing facts. I remember something like, at the time, at least 90% of the world's Christmas trees and ornaments were being manufactured in and around Yiwu and being sold there. Similarly, 80% of the world's zips and buttons, plush toys, as you mentioned, but also Ganesha statues and Krishna murtis and literally everything that you might be able to imagine. Very quickly, a little bit about my background for those who don't know. I lived in China between 2002 and 2009. And this was really an epochal time in the country's opening up. China had just joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Beijing had won the bid to host the 2008 Olympic Games. So there was really a kind of visceral energy that was palpable across the country in those years. Just in terms of the architecture or the geography of the city, the capital city, Beijing, it seemed to be kind of spitting up entire new neighborhoods in what felt like weeks. And indeed, I remember doing an interview with the mayor of Beijing before the Olympic Games to find out that municipal maps were actually being changed and renewed every 3 months in the 2 or 3 years leading up to 2008 because there were such dramatic changes. And China's rise was not limited to just export-oriented factories and the kind of shiny new physical infrastructure either. Indicating one of the most startling shifts in power relations, Beijing had also begun to emerge as the globe's chief creditor, and it had accumulated the world's largest foreign currency reserves, and increasingly and particularly after 2008 became a financing powerhouse, financing the spending sprees of Western nations, including Spain. where I'm sitting right now. So during the 7 years that I spent in China, I worked in three capacities. Initially as a teacher, I was teaching at a university called Beijing Guangbo Shuiyan, which translated as the Beijing Broadcasting Institute. And I was teaching news writing in English. Subsequently, I was an advisor to the Confederation of Indian Industry, to CII. I was like their Beijing-based China advisor for about 5 years. And overlapping with that, I worked as a journalist, eventually becoming the China bureau chief for the Hindu. I was, I think at the time, I'm not sure about now, but at the time I was the only Chinese-speaking Indian foreign correspondent based in China, which I always found amazing, considering that together we formed a third of the world's population and were a very important part of the geostrategic picture. But although Indians remained sort of obsessed with China, there was very little investment in actually trying to understand or learn about it, as evidenced by the fact that there were so few journalists actually stationed over there. When I moved to China in 2002, like most Indians, I think I knew very little about it. And that was understandable because there had been a long diplomatic freeze between the countries. At the time, there were no direct flights. You had to go, if you wanted a direct flight, you had to go on Ethiopian Airlines, which used to stop between Beijing and Addis Ababa and Delhi. So that was the only way to do a direct flight. And trade was only worth, bilateral trade was only worth about $4.95 billion then in 2002. A few years later in 2008, it had zoomed up to 52 billion. So the growth in those years was really very exponential. My first impressions of the country were really, as you also mentioned earlier, about scale. I think the size was something that really hits you. The roads, the buildings. And this was not only true of modern China, but throughout the history of China. So that if you looked, for example, at the Forbidden City, it was just huge. I mean, you had these dramatically huge courtyards that would intersperse the buildings. And I think the idea that the architecture of authority was large and imposing was something that was very cultural. We saw it replicated during the communist period as well. So all the big communist buildings, again, relied on this kind of gargantuism and size and heft as a symbol of authority. And then that's something that also translated into modern and contemporary times. But, you know, as I lived in the city and learned Chinese, and I ended up living a very local life. Unlike a lot of expats, I did not live in the suburbs in Shuyi. I did not live in the diplomatic compounds. I lived in the hutongs, which were the old heart of the city of Beijing, in a very, very sort of local area, and spent a lot of time with Chinese people. Sort of working class Chinese people. And I learned, I think, quite soon that a lot of the stereotypes I had about the Chinese as somehow being inscrutable and unfriendly and inhospitable were completely wrong. And I found that they laughed readily, a lot, easily, had a great sense of humor, were very into teasing people and teasing me as an Indian as well. They were kind of rustic and easy to approach. Like in India, I felt that people welcomed you very effortlessly into their homes. This was a class thing. And I think that's sort of similar to India as well. So that the sort of lower down the socioeconomic order you went, the more open they were and sort of it brought you into their home. If you met some posh Chinese in a mall, they were not going to invite you to their house. But if you were in the hutongs, you could just wander in and out like a family member. If you took a bus into the countryside, the peasants shared their eggs and oranges and nuts with you on a bus, just like people would on a train in India. They liked to tease and gossip. And there was also something to the sort of rhythm of everyday life in the hutongs that was, again, very familiar to an Indian. You had the itinerant vendors that would pass by there. So, you know, in the winter, you had the person who would bring you the coal briquettes to your house, the coal briquette wala, the goldfish seller, the candied crab apple wala in the autumn, the kabadi wala who would come and take your trash away, the newspaper wala in the afternoons, the knife sharpener guy, all of that, you know, the idea of a village in a city, you still had that in the Beijing of the time. People addressed each other as family in familial terms, just as they do in India. So you didn't call people Mr. or Mrs., but Ai, Shushu, Nai Nai. Ai is auntie, Shushu is uncle, Nai Nai is grandmother, just as you would here. And it was a very interesting time indeed, I think, to be an Indian over there. One of the main kind of stories that I ended up often doing, especially when there were high-level visits of either Indian dignitaries visiting China or the other way, my newspaper or television channel back in India would say, go and do a piece on perceptions, meaning wander around the city of Beijing or whichever city I was in with a mic and ask people, what do you think of India? So over the years, I spent a lot of time doing this and gathered a lot of reactions. And I suppose one of the most common things I would hear about when I would say I'm Indian, what are your impressions of India, would be about Buddhism. And everybody would be like, oh, India, Buddhist country, Poja, and they would kind of do a namaste sign. And if I told them that Buddhism had died out in India, thousands of years ago, it would be faced with great incomprehension. Also, Hindi movies, I think particularly with a certain demographic, people who were in their 40s, 50s and older had sort of been watching movies from the 1950s, 60s through till the 1980s, were very familiar with a few Hindi movies that were massive hits, from Avara, of course, to Karwan, Noori, Do Biga Zameen. There was a whole lot of them, including people bursting out into songs. I've got reams and reams of footage from the time of people dancing and singing Avara Gu to Avara Gu in dubbed Chinese, taxi drivers included. There was more direct criticism. I often got things like, oh, India doesn't have a one-child policy. It should have a one-child policy. You have too many people. There would be remarks about the chaos of democracy, and how we were a kind of warning for what would happen to China if China went democratic. So, you got this whole range from positive to very negative, but always very direct. But I remember thinking that something interesting was happening, and there was a shift when in 2006, 2007, I went to an old bicycle repairman that used to be down the Hutong I lived in and asked him this question, what do you think of India? And initially he was very hesitant and said, oh, I know nothing about India. I don't want to answer. And I insisted and said, there must be something, like what comes to your mind? Just tell me anything. And he demurred again. But when I really insisted, he agreed and he sat down and he said, India, let me think. What do I think of India? And then he said, well, what I think of India is that their telecom policy is very advanced. And I was like, what? And he was like, yes, because they have so much choice. And, in China, we have a duopoly and we can hardly choose what kind of telephone we want. And we have to pay very high prices, unlike in India, which has these very low costs. And so I was blown away by the fact that this guy would have that kind of knowledge. But I think it was also a reflection of the fact that there had been a broadening out of the kind of coverage that we were getting about India and India's general positioning in China at the time. I'm talking about 2006, 2007. There was also a lot of interesting reactions on the other side. I mean, I think in India, we had very little knowledge about China. And when I asked the reverse question in India, I would get the full spectrum between pride and prejudice. People who either believed everything was so amazing in China and we should emulate it in every way, or people who thought that China was the biggest enemy and there was nothing at all that we could learn from it. There was also a belief in India, which I think was a sort of almost desperate belief, which was that things can't be that amazing in China, right? It's only in the cities, right? The moment you go out of the cities, there's all this poverty. There was this kind of desperation to be told that China is as poor as India, because there was almost a disbelief that Shanghai and Beijing could look like that. And so there was this belief that they must be throwing away all the old people, the poor people behind a curtain somewhere. But I must say, I traveled the length and breadth of the country. I visited about 25 Chinese provinces during the years I lived over there. And, I went looking for poverty porn, as you might call it. And I was taken to a village, I remember, in Ningxia, which is one of the poorest provinces in China. And I met these two old couple. They were supposed to be like really poor, and everybody was talking about how poor they were. And they were sitting, in a room, which in a poor village, which had been the victim of desertification. So most people had left for the cities, but they had a motor bicycle, they had fans, they had a refrigerator. By if you were looking at consumer products definitions in India, they were very firmly middle class. And this was supposed to be like the deepest poverty that you could find in a village in China. I am quickly running out of time, so I'm trying to figure out what I should talk about. I also lived in China in 2003, and in fact began my reporting career writing about a strange new virus that had begun over the winter of 2002, and that the Chinese government was covering up, and that was a novel kind of coronavirus. So in many ways, it was hilarious that that's how I began my China journey, and we seem to have come full circle today. I do think that China has learned a lot of lessons from 2003, and a lot of its success in having controlled the virus in China so successfully. I mean, we're in an ironic position today where the virus originated in China, but China is probably the safest place in the world today for the coronavirus. But they did learn a lot and take that on board from SARS, as did the whole region, which is why I think South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, a lot of these countries have been, and Vietnam, have been relatively successful in how they've handled the coronavirus, as opposed to Europe, for example, where I am based right now. So I'll end it there. I'm very happy to take any questions later on. I do think that the period I'm talking about in China was a very distinct period. And I think that you can kind of trace one epochal change after Xi Jinping came to power in 2011, 2012. And the China of today and the trajectory it's taken is quite different from the one I would have predicted 10 years ago. But I will leave it there, and we can always pick up some of these conversational threads later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Go to Mahesh to give his thoughts and perceptions about China. Mahesh, your audio, please. Yeah.
Sorry, folks. Thanks a lot, Venky, and thanks a lot, Mr. Balraman, and for everyone who's present here, and Pallavi for setting that fabulous stage about, it's a beautiful backdrop on which one can work on China. So my experience, just to give a little bit of my background, I'm primarily an educator. I started off by, I spent many years developing the running programs in India. My interest was largely on India. I used to run Indology programs for American-based and British-based museums, and also for educators, people who are teaching about India. I used to run programs in India, giving them experiential learning on different facets about India. So I was primarily an India man, and I had this big apathy for China, like most Indian people. So I had one very long stint in the Nalanda archaeological site in Bihar. And I used to have this person who was my guide there, an elderly person. And this gentleman always used to tell me, Mahesh, you have to come here and see this beautiful Chinese museum, which is being constructed by the Chinese. And I used to kind of, for years after year, I used to tell him that, no, I'm not really interested. And one fine day, he took me there. And what struck me was this huge map of China. And in that map, the Xinjiang province in the west of China, and the connection between India and China through the back or through the west, the pathways through which some of the ancient travelers of China came to India and vice versa, it was just so compelling on me. And I decided that I have to go there. And Pallavi, you You probably were there in China at that time. It was in 2009 and 2008, I think, was my first visit. I landed in Beijing, and I attended, I was there for a BMW Foundation and a CII meeting. Then I took off and I spent about a couple of weeks in the region of Zhengzhou. The region of Zhengzhou is very, very important because that's where, if you want to really learn what China is, then it's between this place called Zhengzhou and Xi'an. And that is where you really learn what China's glorious past is. And you'll also end up really understanding who Chinese are and what their backgrounds are, what their cultural moorings are, and why they think the way they think today. Right, so I start from there and then went all the way to Kashgar, which is in the extreme west of China. Traveled very extensively, and so that was my passion. While that was my passion, I also had a different kind of a profession. From 2005, I have been running a global leadership program for the Tuck Executive Education. I'm a partner of Professor Vijay Govindarajan of the Tuck Executive Education. And they have a flagship program called Global Leadership. This flagship program called Global Leadership 2030 it's a program which is offered for about 5 large US-based multinational companies and 1 British company, which is Rolls-Royce. So we also had in the consortium, we had John Deere, we had Colgate, we also had Cigna, which is into healthcare. So we had Corning. So I'm naming these companies specifically. It's because the bundle of these companies where you have Rolls-Royce, which is an extremely high-tech, a company which has got an extremely complicated secret sauce, to a company like Colgate, which is like a pure vanilla. It's toothpaste, right? It's very simple to very complicated company. So I had this. And then you have a whole lot of in-betweens where a company like Corning, which has got a complicated IP, to a John Deere, which is not all that complicated. So I was dealing with these companies, but in India. And because of my interest in China, I started, like Pallavi, I started taking up a liking for China. I began connecting a lot of dots from the past to the present. And that's, incidentally, ethnography is my specialty, and that's the reason why Tuck School also kind of absorbed me into their programs. And then they said that, you got to design this program. And, the China module was already happening for this global leadership program. They said that you got to handle this program, you got to run this program, you got to redesign this program and do it for us. And that's how I got involved with China and started seeing certain different aspects of China, largely from an American lens, but also from working on developing these leaders who were kind of partly struggling, partly in a dominant position. Some of them partly in a dominant position, some of them struggling, and some of them kind of really given up hopes and and literally, you can say like crying and yelling in pain about doing business in China. So that's the companies, and then every year we had to train about 50 of those senior executives, and all these senior executives are it's a global team. So people from playing global roles in different countries, and therefore, and also working with Tuck, it was also a great advantage because as a person who was designing the curriculum, I had the advantage of engaging, brooking. I could draw faculty from Tuck. I could draw faculty from any other university in the US, and also a lot of local universities in China. And plus also working with the CEOs of American and Chinese companies working in China. So putting these curriculums together and running it is what I was doing I've been doing for about 5 to 6 years in China. And then there was about 3 years I had a lead time to design this curriculum before I could actually implement it for them. And during this phase, I also went through this transition of China Xi Jinping coming in, and then this full metamorphosis of China actually happening. So that's overall my experience in China. So with this as the background, I would like to share with you, I am not a faculty, right? I'm not a teacher, but I have gained a lot from my ability to design curriculums for these companies, and also deciding to a large extent on how do I bring faculty inside. And most importantly, I've had the reason why Tuck hires me and uses my capabilities is my ability to actually get people or the participants to learn directly from people. Experiential learning was my specialty. So my job involved taking people and putting them for half a day in a small little Communist Party office in a village, and then bringing them out and then having conversations with them and learning about apathy and things like that. So, or people going to villages and spending time in villages. And so that's the kind of background I come from. So what I'm going to put here is a few things which I learned. They are not necessarily in a few order, but I thought definitely there would be a few people at least in this cohort or in this group who may not know some of them. Some of you might know about it partly. What I learned is that in China, there is a deal. There is a deal between the rulers and the subjects. Now, this is a deal which was made. This deal came into sometime in 600 BC. It's known as the Mandate of Heaven. And the Mandate of Heaven, the deal says that the emperor is bestowed. They have a notion of a heaven. They don't necessarily believe in gods and goddesses, but they do have a notion of a heaven. Metaphorically, let us assume that the heaven is like the ocean, and the earth is like a ship, the only ship which is in the ocean. And the emperor has the mandate of the heaven to steer the ship in a way that there is harmony at all times, right? That's the mandate of the emperor, or the person who is ruling. And then there are subjects in the ship, in the earth, and their responsibility is to serve the king, right? And they have to serve the emperor and follow the emperor. And the reason is because there is a deal, and the deal is that the emperor is delivering harmony. The emperor is delivering progress. And that's the reason why, that's the deal which kind of has sailed China in the past. And that is the deal between the subjects and the emperor. And then what happens is, the mandate of the heaven says that subjects have the rights to rebel, right? You can rebel, but you better be sure that the emperor's axe will fall on your neck, right? You better be prepared to die. Now, in the same virtue, it also tells the emperor that if your responsibility is to lead and righteousness, you got to deliver. And if you don't deliver, there's going to be a rebel. There's also the mandate of the heaven also tells that from time to time, the heaven will give clues to the people that righteousness is being defiled. And what are those clues? Those clues are disease, earthquakes, natural calamities, and also foreign enemies ganging up and trying to break the fort and come into the country, right? Now, this mandate of heaven might sound very much like a fantasy, but this mandate of heaven has been in vogue in China. So in China, there was an imperial period for a long time, all the way until about 17th century. In those 2000 years, there were many dynasties which come up and go down. And every time when a dynasty came up, it is because there was a rebel, and this rebel put his foot down. Very largely, almost always, the rebellion happens. It starts from the intellects. It starts from the intellectual circles. There are wise people who start voicing up, and then eventually there are armed people who take up arms, and then the rebels come after, and of course the emperor comes back with the force, and then eventually it becomes a civil war, Then the civil war kind of ends, the emperor is gone, and then the hero becomes a new emperor, and then the new dynasty starts off, and then the people follow the new dynasty. And then there comes a time when the new dynasty kind of plateaus out, and then the kingdom is gone and a new kingdom comes up. Now, this cycle has been going up and down in China. And the last cycle in China was kind of broken in the century of humiliation, what Chinese call it, when Westerners, for the very first time, foreigners, it was not the Chinese, but the foreigners, caused calamity in China. They came into China and ruled China for about 100 and odd years, which the Chinese call as the century of humiliation. I'm making this point because for Chinese, it is all right if the problem is within China. There are ups and downs, dynasties come and go, but it's all Chinese. Yes, there are people from outside who come in, and whoever comes from outside, we kind of fold them inside, like in India. But there was this 100 years of break, and after which they went away. The new dynasty, once again, there was a civil war, and the dynasty, what we have now, is the CCCP, right? Now, CCCP still has this deal with the people of China, right? So China as an authority has a very strong deal with the people. And also, we have to remember that all what I talked about, this mandate of heaven, along with that, there is also this mandate of heaven just doesn't stay by itself. It is also kind of scaffolded with other philosophies and other values of China, like the Confucius values and also the Sun Tzu values. So all these are basis of the underlying belief system of the Chinese people, right? And the underlying belief system of not just the Chinese people, of anybody, even for us as Indians, the underlying belief system of our values and philosophy drives our behavior. Behavior is only the manifestation, right? Behavior is kind of driven by the underlying belief system. And behavior of and the collective behavior of a country is stemming from the collective belief system of the nation. Now, these are the underlying belief system of that country. So it's not like somebody coming and saying that China is an oppressive state or it's an authoritarian state. Yes, it is an authoritarian state, but that doesn't mean that the people are unhappy there. People are proud of their culture. People are very, very proud of that they managed to maintain this heritage in all these years. So that's where China comes from. And with this as a mooring, you drop down to present day China. They have a vision. Xi Jinping has a vision. There is no country today in the world which actually has a vision. Xi Jinping has a vision, and his vision is to deliver the Chinese people as the #1 country in the world, right? Great vision to have. And that vision is kind of backed with this values, the traditional Chinese values, which includes the mandate of heaven and the Confucius values and everything else, with which there are roles the people are supposed to follow. Now, this is the single most important differentiator between China and any other country, and it kind of percolates down into everything else. So that's one aspect of it. I would now quickly drop a few thoughts on some of those other things which I learned along the way. And I will try to keep those quick and small, but you will be able to connect the dots with the kind of a capstone which I said on how Chinese people think or what drives them to behave the way they are. So it is a bureaucratic authoritarian rule. It is not a dictatorship. It was a dictatorship when Mao was there. Subsequently, there has been successions in China, a series of well-planned successions, which does not exist in any other communist country, but it was there in China. Of course, Xi Jinping has taken that away, right? And is this a dictatorship? Only time will tell us. Only time will tell us. As long as he's winning, you cannot argue that it is a dictatorship. And it's also very difficult to say that the people have not given him the mandate, but there is something going on in Hong Kong. There is something going on, the intellects are getting arrested and all these are happening. Yeah. So it is a bureaucratic, authoritarian kind of a government, but it's gone through a transition. Mao, then 4 peaceful successions, And then once again, there is there is a possibility that there won't be a succession. Number two, China is a country which believes in meritocracy, right? Meritocracy is very, very important for them. And this is not something which was imposed by the government or by the Chinese Communist Party. Meritocracy is something which comes to China way back from the 8th century, 12th century AD, where there is an administrative system. You need to be good. You need to be very, very good. You need to have excelled in school, not only in your studies, but you should have been good in games. You should have been in extracurricular. You should have been in everything else. Then you get a ticket to the party. Once you get a ticket to the party, then you are judged. You are rated. As you pass out from school, you go to college. If you go to college, and it's not just that they are rating you, how good are you in party affairs, but how good are you in your society, and how good are you in your academics. When you are good in all these things, you go climb up the party ladder. So you can imagine the people who are sitting right on top in the Politburo of China and the 7-member committee who are reporting to Xi Jinping, they are very, very, very highly qualified and very, very capable people who have raised up, who have climbed up the ranks and come all the way up. That's another thing which is to be very important. You need to. Now, why I say this is it's very important. It's because if you, as a CEO of a company, end up in one of these cities in China and end up discussing with the local Communist Party office and the government official of putting up, let us say, a factory in China, or about doing a joint venture with the semiconductor factory in China and India, you better be sure that the person who's sitting there is amongst the best CEOs in the semiconductor industry who's sitting there and you're talking to. Right? So that's something which is important about China. Next, there is no inheritance in China. By this, what I mean is that in India, we had a legacy. When British went, they didn't go away. They left us a work in progress kind of a administrative system, be it railways or be it the administrative system or whatever it is. But for China, there was nothing like that. When they got the country, it was a clean slate development. They had to learn everything. So they had this grand vision saying that the century of humiliation, we got to come out and we got to become the best of the best. So there was a vision. The vision was very clear. And then the party discipline was very clear. The roles were very, very clear. And the commitment to the party and to the, to the Communist Party chief was also clear. But the mission was all a series of experiments. How they went about getting it was a series of experiments after experiments of experiments. So that's another thing which I learned. And one other thing I would like to talk about is when China is centralized and decentralized. This is another very important thing you need to keep in mind. By that, what I mean is, remember that 85% of China, now this is 2016, I don't know if this has changed, 85% of the total government spend of China is done by district level. It is done by the local governments. The central government or the federal government spends only about 15%. Now, even in the most developed economies, the rate would be something like about 50% at best. Whereas in China, the federal government's share of spend is only 15%, whereas the state government is not even the state government, but the provincial government, the local government spend is about 85%. And that's another very important thing we have to remember. One more very important aspect, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, all the communist countries, see that when we talk about freedom, there are three kinds of, there are three axes to freedom, right? So you have the freedom of, you have the personal freedom, then which means, I'm free to talk, my freedom of speech and everything else. Then you have a political freedom, right? By political freedom, what I mean is I can, represent a party and I can, represent groups of people. Then you have the economic freedom. Now, Soviet Union and most of the communist bloc countries, they started with political freedom, right? They started with political freedom, and they started with which kind of is not possible without a personal freedom, personal and political freedom together. And then they allowed markets to take care of economic freedom. Reforms and everything else comes in once the political parties are set, and then they argue and bring in. And that was part of the reason why most of them failed, at least so say most authors or scholars. Whereas in China, they never gave the personal freedom and political freedom. Right? The freedom what they gave is the economic freedom. And that is also kind of limited, controlled to a large extent by the government. And that's the freedom which they gave. Now, that's another important aspect which you need to remember. Right? So remember all these together. You have this kind of a freedom. Along with that, you have the mandate. Along with that, you have the acceptance of the emperor. And then, most importantly, to top all this, what the Communist Party has delivered to China is a home run year after year for the last 20 to 30 years, right? So that's the kind of a competitor you are actually up against. So I will end my talk with this, but then feel free to ask during your Q&A sessions to ask about companies and the struggle for IPs or and things like that, anything to do with business, and how best I will try to answer, and I'll try to connect the dots to the kind of a stage which I've set for my talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mahesh. We move on to Mr. Pandit, who has got 3 significant areas he wants to touch upon from his experience in Hong Kong and the Far East.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Mr. Balraman, Group Captain Vijay Kumar, MMA, and Venky for having me on this panel. And it's indeed a great pleasure talking to the group at MMA. I will briefly share my experience of working with Chinese people, competing with Chinese companies, and supplying or treating Chinese companies as customers. My experience is in actually 2 parts. One is about 2 decades back, and one more recently between 2015 and 2018. And I'll turn it over at the end of my talk back to Venky to comment on if he has seen any significant changes since these time periods. The background to this is that I set up the Asia Pacific Regional Office for Urban Mills in Hong Kong. And I set it up from scratch. So I recruited a number of Chinese people, Chinese staff, recruited Chinese sales managers. And we were doing business supplying fabric to a number of Chinese garment manufacturers who used to then ship the garments over to US or Europe. Also, those were my customers. And we used to compete with a large number of Chinese fabric manufacturers in securing business for our fabric. So these are the 3 perspectives I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the softer aspects of working with Chinese, both as customers, competitors, and dealing with staff. Coming to the Chinese staff, one of the most important aspects that I noticed was their total focus on quality and productivity. Compared to an Indian staff member, they were not as quick in grasping things. They took a lot more time, they needed a lot more hand-holding. But once they understood the process, understood the requirements, they could do the same thing again and again, 100 times, and 100 times correct out of 100. I could trust my staff with shipping documents, bank documents, invoices, any operational aspects. I could close my eyes and there would be absolutely no fault. This was one of the most important aspects I noticed. And their productivity was 2 times or 3 times what I used to observe back in India. The second very important aspect I noticed, which I think is a basic philosophy in China and Chinese people, is the face concept, the concept of face. And We don't have that in India. What it means is that I cannot lose my face in front of either a customer or somebody superior. So they will go to any extent to make sure that the face is protected. This I noticed very strongly with my salespeople. If they went and met a customer and promised that they would deliver something to the customer, they would do it. And one of my biggest drawbacks as leading the team of sales guys was to be able to make sure that the back-end team in India met what they had committed to the customer. And it was a hard time retaining the salespeople because they would not want to lose face with the customers. And if once or twice the deliveries got delayed or there were quality problems with the shipments, they would just leave the company. They would leave the company rather than lose face with customers. I think this is something that is vital and something that drives the Chinese mindset, the face concept. In fact, it goes to such an extent that my wife was a teacher in the secondary school in Hong Kong, teaching English to Chinese children, young girls in the age group of 14 to 17, 18. And they used to say, we work very hard, struggling to learn the English language so that we don't want you as our teacher to lose face with others. So that's the extent to which this drives their work ethic. The turning to the aspect of competition, what I had observed was that they do not have a profit motive. We used to work with a certain profit objective. The Chinese competitors had no profit objective. All they had was market share objective. They want to grab market share. The other aspect was they always work backwards. We work forwards. What do I mean by that? The way Chinese looked at it was, if a particular garment has to land and sell in a store in US at $10, they used to work backwards and say, I have to supply to a Gap or a CNA store at $2.50. I will make sure I deliver it at $2.50. What we would do, we would take the raw material cost, the overhead cost, add our profit margin, and say we will be able to deliver the garment at $4.50 or $5. We were never able to compete with the Chinese competitors. So one of the biggest lessons was, how do you compete? And I think Venky may attest to this, whether it still holds. And competing with Chinese companies, particularly in manufacturing products, is extremely difficult. Dealing with Chinese customers is equally difficult because they expect to be extremely agile, nimble, responsive. So if they say that I want the fabric or a garment sample on a particular day, you better make sure it is delivered on that particular day. If I said I will send you the shipping documents at 5 o'clock by Monday, you can be sure 5:05, I will get a call saying, I have not received the document so far. And to us in India, I'll send it to you by tomorrow evening. And the evening spans from, anywhere from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., or it could be next day or the day after. So that just didn't work. And some of the hardest lessons I learned was these aspects of making sure that if you promise something to your customer, you deliver it, come what may. So let me not take too much time. I will just turn back to Venky and just say that some of the underlying work ethic, the Chinese mindset, their obsession with detail and meeting commitments is what drives Chinese companies and the Chinese economy. This is my personal belief. And I don't know if Venky has experienced the same or others, Pallavi and Mahesh have a similar experience. We would be glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pandit. One interesting point is that the Hong Kong people still maintain a distinctly different ethic. They are the same race, but different. And a lot of what you said is absolutely correct for Hong Kong, but varies in some levels in the mainland China.
Actually, most of my customers were in mainland China, and the fabric manufacturers competing with us, garment manufacturers competing with us, were also mainland China. Okay. Hong Kong was mainly the staff. But I take your point. There could be difference between mainland and Hong Kong.
Right. So we go on to some feedback from Mr. Balraman, and then we're open for questions.
You're on mute, Mr. Balraman.
Yeah. No, this does give a very wide perspective. We have see, I have read Pallavi's book, from beginning to end. So the Mahesh's perspectives, so I'm hearing for the first time. And each one of you gave a very different aspect, and it's really, really comprehensive. And my only regret is that we have slated it for only one day. We should have maybe a 2-day session. I think we should take some questions from the audience. Group captain, can you select some? Hello.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We have.
Don't bring every question that comes to you without thinking. Select.
No, yes. Yes, sir. After this, so much of insight, sir, we have to think very seriously because the number of questions have come. Yes.
Good question. 3 to 5 good questions. Don't just ask question that comes.
Yes. So we have got questions from from the social media. Over 1,600 viewers watch the program, so you know the number of questions which comes. As Mr. Balraman advised, we picked up the first question is come from the President of MMA, Ravi. He is also joined us this evening. Welcome, Ravi. His question, sir: what do we need to attract Apple and Samsung to become large players in India? Samsung today account 28% of Vietnam GDP. Is federal structure of governance a problem in India to attract large companies to build global footprints for these world leaders? Any one of you, Venky, you could like to.
Yeah, I'll take it. When I travel to Hanoi to visit some of my factories, and I'm driving the Samsung factory, it just goes on for a mile. It is humongous. You know, those are the really giant factories. And I think to myself, that kind of opportunity wouldn't be great to have it in India. I can at one place provide employment for 14,000 to 20,000 people. So what, to my mind, makes some of these companies nervous is, will policies change every 3 years, every 2 years, every 5 years? And when they change, they can change helter-skelter. That's what I said about 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I was very polite. It's actually, in the worst case, a snakes and ladder.
Can I come in here? Hello.
Please.
Mahesh actually gave me a very, very good insight a couple of days before when I was talking to him. He said that in China, the government makes sure that the total value chain in any industry is competitive. You see, if the government makes a decision that they will make a whole business, the entire value chain of, say, in the case of Samsung, cell phone making, if the government decides that it will remain export competitive, then government can make sure that it removes all the bottlenecks, all the additional unwanted costs, unwanted taxes. Mahesh, would you like to come in?
So, just to specifically answer this this question, we need to look at the whole value network. And there are 2 ways first, let me explain what I mean by this value network or the value chain or the industry value chain. Very often when we talk about value chain, one gets confused with the company's value chain or your particular industries, but I'm talking about the entire value chain or the value network of one particular industry. So if we want Samsung to come, if you look at Samsung, Samsung is of course into electronic appliances. They are also into PCBs and components, which goes into these appliances. They are also into, semiconductors. They are also into wafer manufacturing and fab labs. They probably don't have raw material. What happens in China is, today, if we say that you can't, if you want Samsung phones, you don't get Samsung phones. You have to get Foxconn to come here and manufacture Samsung phones, or you need to get one of the contract manufacturers of Samsung into India. And the government today is giving an incentive. I think it's a 7 or a 10% incentive, which we give for these companies if they move their contract manufacturing units to India. They also give some kind of a capital subsidy. But then what happens is China can kind of put brakes on the components, right? They can keep, making it difficult for us to actually bring in, because we don't have a component manufacturing industry in India. Now, let us assume that we come out with a very audacious plan and we say that we are going to have our own silicon ignite manufacturing units. We are also going to have these massive fab labs, which incidentally, India is already doing it. That we are going to have fabrication units where we are going to be slicing and making these fibers, the wafers. Then we're going to have silicon packing units, and we're going to attract people like Samsung, and we're going to attract Intel to come and manufacture these chips. And then we're going to also encourage the components and PCB manufacturers, and we're going to also bring in these contract manufacturers. Let's say the government decides that we want the entire value chain to be in India, and we kind of promote everything. But today, because of for positivity of words, I'm saying that because of failure of globalizations, countries are also kind of de-risking themselves. What they're trying to say is that this entire value chain, because we put the whole thing in China, today we're having a difficulty, right? The entire value chain is sitting in China now. And that's the problem today. The companies OEMs are not able to move out of China. It's because different pieces of their value chain is kind of stuck in China. And if we don't do that, we are not going to get economies of scales. And if we do that now, because globalization is kind of more or less, there are a lot of skeptics, a lot of people think that this has a lot of countries are kind of building walls. Small countries like Korea, which kind of controls the entire or large chunks of the value chain of the semiconductor and all the way down to mobile phones, they'll begin thinking, why do I need to put this entire value chain in another country? Why should I shift the problem from China to India? They're going to be thinking 20 years ahead. So it's a very difficult question to answer. In a sense, it can be answered, but then that would come in with possibly some kind of a tie-up with Malaysia, another tie-up with Singapore, so that we also do certain pieces of the electronic industry and the semiconductor industry, and we also cooperate with other countries and go back and tell these big OEMs that you're not putting all eggs in the one basket, right? So
if I could just step in, sorry, please continue.
No, go ahead. I'm done. Pallavi,
are you sure?
Yes.
Go ahead,
No,
Pallavi.
I was just saying that I've spent the last 4 years in Japan. And, in many ways, Japan and India make a perfect fit, theoretically, at least. Japan has a lot of money to invest, and it has a lot of technological know-how. And India has a sort of young labor force, and we need the investment. And more than anything else, Japan has a reason to diversify away from China, given their tricky relationship. And before that, I was in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So I've seen time and time again, countries that are desperate to diversify away from China because they find that they have put all their eggs in that basket and they think that there's a geopolitical risk over there, but they are still not picking India or not actually making that commitment to come to India. And places like Vietnam get picked time, even Bangladesh, but Vietnam in particular would get picked time and time again. And I think it has a lot to do with what Venky was saying. What I've always been told is the stability issue and the fact that they're just not sure that there's a policy environment that is stable enough in India, that it might not change completely on its head in a year or two, and that many countries have been, once bitten, twice shy. In Japan, what happened with Ranbaxy, for example, is something that looms very large. So there's just an idea that there is poor quality control. There's an idea that there's a lack of stability, that there is a sort of hiding of information, that what you see is not necessarily what you get. And of course, that you do not have the same kind of infrastructure that you would get in a country like China or even Vietnam that's complete and allows the whole supply chain to connect, so that you have the roads, you have the ports, you have the time, the amount of time it takes to turn containers around, all of that going. So for India to kind of emerge as a viable alternative to China or other countries in Southeast Asia, it's not just enough for them not to be China. They have to actually convince countries that it makes economic sense and that they can provide that environment. And I do not think that they are able to do that competitively at the moment.
If I may add to that, completely, I'm sorry that this is becoming like a two-way discussion, but I'll just end with this and then hand it off to Venky so that he can, or with Balram so he can steer this. But just to add to that, yes, a certain place where everything would happen and everything will go by the law is something which is a basic expectation. Definitely that is an expectation, and we'll lack that, and we need to build on that. And without that, none of this is going to happen. That's one thing. But the other thing what we also have to understand is, if you read literally, I mean, this whole US and China tension, which is kind of not tension, it's a war which is kind of opened up, an economic war, and the helplessness of the American and the Western companies which are sitting there in China. This whole thing is making, because companies are planning ahead 20 years and 30 years, and how would I place my bets in the long term? So when they look at that, what they have, one of the lessons what they've taken away is that China is a country where the economic growth and political power are synonymous, right? Economic growth happens in that country, political stability, meaning in an authoritarian regime, I get everything in a platter. There's no need for me to innovate. Everything is in kind of perfect condition, right? The infrastructure is smooth, the laws are perfect, and I can get everything. And then they're paying a heavy price for that. So there are a lot of these large companies which are beginning to learn, saying that we got to also not, it's in maybe the most stable country with the, and very often they also need to come to developing countries, right? So a developing country which is got growth and which also having political stability very often ends up being an authoritarian rule, and that's another fear factor. So the companies are also beginning to say that we got to begin to learn to work in these pockets of excellence in places like India and other countries. So that's another parallel development which is kind of happening.
What I see here,
yeah,
I think if the leaders in the government, whoever leads the government, leads the country, the leaders in the government should be very, very clear-minded that making India export competitive is simultaneously the road for economic growth as well as lifting people out of poverty. They often get confused between the two. I mean,
yes.
they
Simple,
think
sir. Absolutely.
you are not helping the poor. There is some confusion about.
Yes.
Yes, which is rooted in our history to some extent.
Yes.
So they do something for the business industry. The opposition says you are not doing anything for the poor. Immediately they say take it from the business and give it to
Yes,
the poor.
poverty alleviation and sort of globalization and export is not necessarily
If you don't
seen as something
understand
that
everything
happens
is the same,
synonymously.
if you're competitive, you will hire people.
Yeah.
If you hire people, you will pay them. Then people will become rich. That was the Chinese method.
Yes. Group
I
captain.
got two questions I will add, so then whoever wants can pick it up. It's all in relation to what you had discussed recently on related to those questions. How do China business leaders view the deterioration in US-China relations, the possibility of decoupling, and even future access to technology? The similar question, one more question on similar lines. Will international resentment toward China mean that the supply chain and the manufacturing begin to steer away from the Asian powerhouse, or will the economic reforms convince foreign investors to stay?
I'll take a first shot at this. Regarding US relations, the people in the industry I talk to are actually very scared. They're very scared. They are on tenterhooks. But they also know that things can change in November or may not change. So there's a wait and watch. Regarding businesses moving out of China, everybody has been doing this roadmap for the last 6 years or at least 4 years, trying to find the China plus one alternative, preparing the groundwork. And then often they still find China still the easier option to go back to. So I think the election result is going to have a lot to do with it. Anybody?
If I might step in very quickly, while I think that there's obviously a lot of uncertainty and as a result, sort of uneasiness about where this might go, I think that we can chart over the last 10 or 15 years very much the realization that it might come to this. And there has been a lot of preparation that's been going into it in China, that there might come a time when they would have to take on the US, and you might have a situation where they would have to decouple. So it's not as though there has been no awareness that this might happen and they've been caught unaware. And as you can see, I mean, for the last 10, 15 years, they've been spending a lot of time on building autonomous systems that kind of keep them separate from a lot of these Western norms. So whether you look at their payment platforms, whether you look at something like Amazon, you know, they did Alibaba. They don't use WhatsApp, they use WeChat. I mean, they're very autonomous technologically. And when you go into China as a foreigner today, into mainland China, you have to adopt all of their technologies in order to be able to function in China. And so I think that there has been this preparation, and there was this dictum, of course, a long-term dictum from Deng Xiaoping onwards about hiding your strength and biding your time. And there was a sense of biding your time. I think under Xi Jinping, very much there is the sense that now is our time. We've been hiding our strength all of this time. Now it's time to kind of come up and challenge. Whether it's too early, that they might have miscalculated. And I think, you know, we kind of see over the next few years how that plays out, whether they miscalculated or not. But I think that there was a deliberateness to this. It's not just something that randomly happened.
You know, like Mahesh said, when heaven is unhappy with you, all the people around will gather themselves against you, and that could happen.
Yes. There's an interesting question which has come from the YouTube viewer, sir. He says, I think India's history of democracy over the last more than 60 years gives it a foundation of stability and adaptation, while China faces an uncertain political transition in the coming years. Do you agree with the statements?
Well, I think there's certainly been one way of putting it, that while China looks far more stable than India, because India has this safety valve of democracy, and the fact that if things go really bad, we can always have an election and change things. Whereas in China, if things go really bad, there's no way of changing things except via revolution. So there's always been an idea that China's kind of surface stability actually hides political vulnerability, whereas India's surface chaos actually hides a deep stability in our political system, which, you know, no longer, there's no question mark in front of India's future as a country. When India first became independent, there were a lot of Western theorists who thought that India would balkanize, right? That India just cannot cohere as a center. It was bound to balkanize. But we have shown almost 100 years through that it's kind of unlikely. I mean, India's political survival is more or less assured, whereas China's political survival right now has much more of a question mark in front of it. There remains the threat that if, for example, if economic growth completely comes to a standstill and the Chinese government is unable to deliver the growth that has really been the cornerstone of its legitimacy, what would happen? So, I mean, I tend to believe that the Chinese are actually quite adept and have also factored this into a place, and that there are ways of moderating China's future. So I do not see a kind of revolution or an implosion of China in the near future, like a lot of Western commentators have been predicting for the last 20 years. However, I do think that this is China's Achilles heel, transitions of power. And I think with Xi Jinping having emerged as a more traditional style strongman that has changed the bureaucratic approach that Mahesh had mentioned earlier, where you had more of a sort of board of governor approach for a while going, that is again going to be something that we need to be keeping an eye on.
You know, Pallavi,
yeah.
China's Achilles heel is that its economic stability and continued growth depend on its ability to export non-stop to United States of America and to other markets. They also have to get copper, aluminum, manganese, magnesium, all from Africa by ships.
Right. So global markets remain extremely important. However, they have spent a lot of time developing their domestic market precisely against to hedge against that scenario where they might not have the same global trade connections with America as they did, the dependence on America as they did. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there, you know, the analogy that used to be used was that the Communist Party is an elephant riding a bicycle, and as long as you have a certain speed, you know, it can just keep going. But the moment that economic speed slows down, it will topple over. So there is certainly some possibility that serious economic slowdown, and which we've seen as a result of the pandemic, the US-China trade war, and so on, might end up being a very serious challenge to the authority of the party.
No, I have also seen that the Chinese government is saying that they will develop domestic market in China. But I also see simultaneously a number of people who have come from the villages to big cities losing jobs because Chinese wage costs have gone up. Factories have shifted to Vietnam and Malaysia and so on. So you see huge empty buildings in big cities. And many people say, I'm going back to my village, but I don't know how to farm. So I don't know whether I'll get a job. I have to find a means for economic livelihood. So they do have this temporary problem.
Yeah.
So a couple of perspectives in this. Number one is, if you look at the GDP growths across the world, China is the only country which has got some kind of a positive growth, right? Most other economies are going to be going on a negative kind of trajectory. That's number one. What this by and large means is that there will be growth. If there is no growth, at least there will be in the same status quo. Now, the next thing is, how does it affect the 1.4 billion people in China? Right? I keep going back to my mandate of the heaven. I keep going back to the same thing because it's very important to understand how the mob thinks. So this 1.4 billion people, I'll put them into three buckets, right? So that there are, and these three buckets of people are people who have been on queue for the last 40 years, and slowly and steadily, they're ending up in paradise, which is the cities, right? So you have roughly about 40% of Chinese people who have joined the city and who are on the far end of the digital divide, or on the other side. And then you have another 20% of the people who are known as the city ants. Now, these are people who live in cities, who serve the city, but who do not have the rights or who do not have the passports to sit in cities, to live in cities.
Hukou.
The hukou holders, you know, the people who do not have the hukou for the big cities. Then you have the people who are in the villages. Now, we got to remember that for all these people, there is a promise which is being made. And the promise is that eventually everybody will be delivered on the other side. And Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is actually working on it. And the narrative is, while we are working on it, you look, no country is really growing. We are the only country which are, at least, it is your hard work and you got to be patient for a while. My take is that given that rest of the world is kind of struggling, given what is the kind of image and pictures which is being projected in US and in India, and also given the fact that the people, these 1.4 billion people in India, in China, do not have access to the world news. They don't know what's going on outside the world. What they know is what is being told to them by the Chinese media. Given all these things, my take is that there will not be any kind of a major instability in the near future, is what my take is.
Good. You are our expert.
Thank you, sir. I think there are so many questions which I would really happy to, but unfortunately we are run out of time. And Mr. Balraman, before thing, I request the people will put a feedback. Your feedback is very important. All the viewers, thank you for so many questions have come, but the speakers during the when they were talking, they covered most of the questions which you asked have been covered because all gamut of the relationship in India and China has been covered in terms of businesses. Thank you so much. And I also want to present a memento on behalf of MMA to distinguished speakers. Mr. Ravi, President MMA, put on your video on behalf of you. We'll present what we do is we present more than 200 masks to the people who are in need, actually, because of COVID time. We thought on your behalf, we'll give it to face masks, which will be very, very useful. With this, use it through an NGO. We reach out to the very people who are really in need of them, and we'll make sure we teach them, educate them that they must use this. And thank you so much. This is how our volunteers from MMA go to different places and hand over this to their respective places.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for your acceptance to do this, and we are really privileged and honored. Thank you so much, Mr. Balraman, for really, facilitating such a great evening. You must have seen the accolades what I received from all over is fantastic. And Mr. Venky Nagan, as usual, I know how seriously you prepared for the last so many days. I know how seriously you took this evening. Thank you so much. Mr. Mahesh Sriram, your insight has been great, and we could really understand what it means in China in terms of the previous as well as the current business session. Pallavi Aiyar, thank you so much for joining from Spain. I know you have spent a lot of time with us. We look forward to seeing you more at MMA. And Mr. Pandit, thanks again so much. And we look forward to keep seeing you again, because there is one question which has really come is what people want to know. What's your advice, one single major advice to every corporate leader if they have to emulate China in terms of the manufacturing policy? I know that there's no end to it because all the thing what you spoke is advice for the manufacturing industry. Thank you so much, and we really enjoyed this evening. And take care, stay safe. Mr. Balraman, to you for your final comments before we close.
You have said everything. So may I just warmly congratulate Venky, Mahesh, Pandit, and the great lady Pallavi from Spain. Thank you, guys. Thank you for sparing your time. Thank you for spending time preparing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, joining, and thank you, Pankaj, and thanks so much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, and good night. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye. Thank you, Venky. Bye-bye. We'll keep in touch. Thank you, Mr. Mahesh. We'll also keep in touch with you. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye. Good night. Great evening.